Good afternoon. Today Luna and I are going to be reading Serafina and the Twisted Staff by Robert Beatty. Just kidding, Luna doesn't want to read, she wants to play. So, we will be reading Serafina and the Twisted Staff by Robert Beatty, chapter 30. We'll be reading with the permission of the author and Scholastic. Chapter 31. The rats were gone. Those dirty, awful, insane creatures had chased her 3 floors down and then simply disappeared. Had they vanished into thin air, or had they slunk back into the walls? Had the rats been some sort of conjuration? She growled in frustration, angered by what had just happened. She was the chief rat catcher. There weren't supposed to be rats in Biltmore House. She had made sure of it for years. But now, all of a sudden, there were hundreds of huge, vicious ones, the likes of which she'd never seen before. And since when did spiders crawl out of the wall and attack? It was as if the animal's only purpose was to scare her off the 3rd floor. Braden sat on the floor beside her, panting, his back against the wall as he tried desperately to catch his breath. "Good night," he exclaimed, shaking his head. "If this is what rat catching is like, you can count me out next time." "Come on," she said, touching his shoulder. "Tell me where we're going," he said as he got up off the floor. "We're going back up there." "What?" he said, holding his ground. "Please say we're not." "Don't you want to see if they're still up there? That was Biltmore's grand staircase. How can there be rats on it?" "I swear your curiosity is going to get you killed one of these days, Serafina. And me too, I think." "Come on," she said. "We've got to see." Gathering her courage, they crept up the basement stairs to the main floor, then came slowly and carefully around and looked up the grand staircase. There were no rats or spiders or centipedes. There was no sign of them at all. They were gone. The moonlight lit the grand staircase in a silver glow, as if inviting them to ascend once more. But as they stared at the foreboding threat of the empty staircase and felt the hairs on the back of their necks tingling, they both knew there was no way they were going to try to get back up to the 3rd floor tonight. That was just about the last place on earth they wanted to go. "There shouldn't be that many rats in the house," Braden whispered. "There shouldn't be any rats in the house," Serafina said, fiercely, smoothing down the back of her neck with her hand. "Something isn't right, Braden. A lot of 4-legged, nasty somethings," Braden agreed. "Come on, let's find some place safe to rest." Avoiding the grand staircase, they used the back stairs to reach the 2nd floor, then padded quietly to Braden's room. Gideon greeted them happily at the door, then came over to Serafina, his tail nub wagging. She knelt down, her eyes closed. She hugged him and petted his head, feeling the warmth in her heart. She was so glad that he seemed to have no memory or confusion about the battle they'd fought against each other that terrible night. While Braden slept in his bed, Serafina was happy to curl up with Gideon in the warm glow of the fireplace and try not to have nightmares of the rats that didn't flee. She awoke a few hours later, just before dawn. She had reconnected with Braden and her pa, and even Lady Rowena. But now, after everything that had happened, breaking the Ming vase, her fight with Gideon, biting the footman, terrifying the guests, and all the rest, she wasn't sure if everyone in the house would be glad to see her. So she stayed low and quiet. But there was one person she thought she could trust, and it might be a perfect sneaky way to get safely into Detective Graython's room when he wasn't there. She quickly ran up the back stairs to the 4th floor, snuck down the hall, and slipped into the 3rd room on the right. "Oh, miss, it's you," said Essie, smiling in surprise, freshly dressed in her maid's uniform, getting ready to start her workday. Essie set down her hairbrush and went to Serafina. "I heard tell about everything that happened. I've been so worried about you. Where'd you go?" "I ran away up into the mountains," Serafina said. "Oh, miss, you shouldn't have done that," Essie said. "That's far too dangerous for a little thing like you." "There are panthers up there." Serafina smiled. "Those were the least of my problems." What happened?" Essie said, clutching her arm. "I'm all right," Serafina said. But then she stepped back and presented her sorry state. "I'm sorry about ruining your nice dress, Essie." "Oh, you never mind about that, miss," Essie said, pulling back towards her. "Come, sit down here on the bed. I can see you're mulling over something. Do you know that man, Detective Graython?" "Yes, I've seen him," Essie said. "He's been asking all sorts of questions about Mr. Vanderbilt and Mr. Olmsted, and about you too, and Master Braden and the dogs." He asked about Gideon and Cedric. Oh, yes, he's been asking after the young master's dog in particular. I can tell you one thing for sure. Everyone is mighty tired of that man. The night before, Serafina hadn't known for sure if she should trust Lady Rowena. But so far, what the girl had said about Detective Grayson had turned out to be true. Do you clean Detective Grayson's room? Serafina asked, finally coming to the purpose of her visit. Essie scowled. Maggie and me are supposed to be cleaning it, but he ain't given us the chance. What do you mean? He always locks his door, and he's given us strict instructions to never enter his room. He could have a dead cat in there for all we know, and there'd be nothing we could do about it. A dead cat? Serafina asked in alarm. It's just an expression, Essie said. Do you have a master key or anything like that? Oh, no, miss. I ain't got permission for that. Most guests don't lock their doors. No reason to. But Mrs. King says if a guest wants privacy, then we should give it to them. Serafina shook her head in frustration. This seemed like another dead end. So what's the big interest in Detective Grayson? Essie asked. I think he's up to no good and I want to catch him at it, Serafina said, which was the God's honest truth. Will you be careful, Essie warned gravely. He strikes me as a bad, awful man. Serafina nodded, remembering the rats the night before. She said, I'll do my best. Then one more thought came into her mind. Which room is Detective Grayson in? She asked Essie. She thought it would be good to double-check what she learned from Rowena. Well, when he first arrived, Mrs. Vanderbilt told us to put him in the Sheridan room, which is a very nice room. But Detective Grayson had some sort of problem with it. What did he say? No one could understand what he was yammering on about, but he complained high and low about it so much that they finally just gave in and put him where he wanted to be. I mean, how rude. To be a guest in someone's house and then demand a particular room? What room did he demand? She asked. The Van Dyke room, up at the top of the stairs on the 3rd floor. This was the same room that Lady Rowena had named, so this wasn't new information in itself. But when Serafina heard Essie say these words, her heart began to thump. The room at the top of the stairs on the 3rd floor. That was right where she and Braden had encountered the rats, and right where Gideon had attacked her, and before that, the chimney swifts. Then she remembered that the black-cloaked Mr. Thorne had used the same room. On my way back from the water closet this morning, Essie continued, I heard the other girls talking about Detective Grayson. What did they say? Well, you know he missed dinner last night, which was extremely rude to Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt. He came in late, went straight up to his room, tracking mud all the way, which poor Betsy had to clean up before Mrs. King saw it in the morning. And then he rang his bell. He had the gall to demand his dinner be brought up to him in his room. The cook had to get himself out of bed, reopen the kitchen, warm up a plate for him, and send the footman all the way up there. Where'd it go? Oh. That would have been no problem at all if he'd showed a speck of gratitude, but he wouldn't even let the footman in his room. He shouted at him to set the tray on the floor outside the door and go away. Serafina listened with fascination. So Detective Grayson is back in the house? Oh yes, he's back, but I wouldn't cry none if Mr. Vanderbilt kicked him right on out again. All the other guests are so friendly and appreciative, especially around the holidays, but he's just very rude and a demanding man. Thank you for all the information, Essie, Serafina said, clutching her arm. You've been a good friend to me. I'll pay you back for your dress as soon as I can. I know you will, miss, Essie said. I've got a few minutes before I have to go. Do you want me to do your hair? It looks like you've been through an awful lot of trouble. Serafina smiled and nodded appreciatively. Yes, that would be nice. How would you like me to do it? Essie said, standing behind Serafina and gathering her hair up into her hands. Have you seen Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough? Serafina asked with a twinkle in her eye. Oh, miss, that would take an hour, Essie said. I'm a-fixin' to get to work. All right, a roll and a twist it is, then, Serafina said, laughing. After talking with Essie, Serafina ventured down to the lower floors. Moving from one hiding spot to another, she watched the comings and goings of the bustling house for the rest of the morning. But she didn't see anything suspicious or out of the ordinary. There was no sign of Detective Grayson. The rat seemed to have gone to ground. She wondered if her two allies had spotted anything. Somehow they had to come up with a plan to defeat Grayson once and for all. They couldn't keep dodging him, but so far they hadn't even been able to get into his room. Something terrible happened every time she tried. She felt like she needed some sort of trap. That afternoon she went outside to patrol the perimeter of the grounds. She wondered if there was a point at which the old man of the forest would attack head-on. From what direction, and in what form would he come? Or would the attack come from Grayson himself within the house? She spotted Mr. Vanderbilt and Mr. Olmsted walking down a path together in the gardens, and hurried to listen in on their conversation. "Have you checked in on the planting crews working down along the river?" Mr. Vanderbilt asked Mr. Olmsted. "They're making good progress," Mr. Olmsted said. "Mr. Schneck has a good eye for the land." Serafina recognized the name of the chief forester they had hired to manage Biltmore's woodlands. "All we need now are a few more decades, and we'll have a lovely forest again," Mr. Olmsted said. The two men laughed a little, but Serafina could see a seriousness in Mr. Olmsted's expression, in the wrinkles around his eyes. The old man was hiding something from Mr. Vanderbilt, just as Lady Rowena had said. "I just want to keep making progress," Mr. Vanderbilt said to Mr. Olmsted as the two friends walked together. "Don't worry, George. We'll keep at it," Mr. Olmsted assured him. "We're going to make it so beautiful here at Biltmore that no one will ever know what it was like before. You and your family and your guests will be able to enjoy the bounty of nature for years to come." "I appreciate that, Frederick," Mr. Vanderbilt said. "I learned long ago," Mr. Olmsted continued, "that whether it's a delicate tea rose or a 3-foot oak, planting and growing requires an immeasurable amount of patience." "I don't always have it," Mr. Vanderbilt said. "Neither do I," Mr. Olmsted admitted. Serafina thought that Mr. Olmsted should have chuckled or smiled when he said that, but he didn't. There was a darkness in him that she did not understand. There were thoughts on his mind that he was not sharing with Mr. Vanderbilt. She wondered again why he'd come back to Biltmore now, at this particular time. As she watched and listened to these two men, she thought about her own life. Years ago, she had often seen these two friends together, walking and planting, talking about what species of tree would grow in each area, how they could bring in more water here, or protect an area from the wind there, like shepherds of the forest. She had never thought about it before, but lately she had started to realize that all the comforts, buildings, and machines around her were once nothing more than someone's dream. In the not-too-distant past, these things had just been an idea in someone's head. Mr. Vanderbilt's grandfather grew up. When Mr. Vanderbilt's grandfather grew up, people had to walk or ride horses to travel great distances, but he imagined trains crisscrossing America. It was only by those trains that his grandson was able to venture from New York to the wilds of western North Carolina. And then his grandson had dreams of his own and built a great house in the mountains. Mr. Edison had imagined a light bulb that would bring light to the darkest night. Other people had imagined the elevator and the dynamo and all of the other inventions her pa worked on every day. But unlike the men of iron, Mr. Olmsted had dreamed of vast gardens and endless forests. Those were the things he'd brought into the world. Thinking back in time, she wondered if the mountains and the rivers and the clouds and even human beings had been God's dream 1,000,000 years before. As she thought about this, she couldn't help but wonder about herself. "Envision what you want to be. Then you will find a way to get there," Wesa had told her in the cave behind the waterfall. She knew she wasn't going to invent a machine or build a great building, but she had to figure out who and what she wanted to be. She had to envision her future, and then she had to get there. When she snuck back into the house that evening, she hunkered down in the second-floor air shaft and tried to think about what she could do. What trick could she use to trap Grayson? She had tried to get into his room and failed. She could barely keep track of where he was, but he had to have some kind of weakness. Restless for some sort of plan, she crawled through the shaft and checked Braden's room, which was empty. So she made her way down to the library. As usual, she entered through the vent near the ceiling. Just as she began climbing down the bookshelves to the library's second-floor walkway, Serafina heard footsteps approaching. She scurried into a hiding spot, crouched down, and waited for someone to enter the room, but no one did. She kept waiting, curious. She was sure she had heard something. It was like the person had paused just outside the door and wasn't coming in. The longer it went on, the more curious she became. Was she mistaken? Suddenly, a figure appeared in the room, but not through the main door like she'd expected. Someone stepped out from behind the upper portion of the room's massive fireplace mantle. It was Lady Rowena. Serafina realized she must have used the hidden passageway that led from the house's second floor directly into the top level of the library. Serafina thought she should reveal herself to Rowena, but there was something furtive about the girl's movements, so she crouched down and watched her. Rowena quickly ran down the finely wrought spiral staircase to the library's main floor, her lavish, dusky rose dress billowing behind her. She looked around as if to make sure no one else was in the room, then darted over to the walnut wall panels just to the left of the fireplace. Serafina crept along the railing, but before she could get to a better vantage point, she heard a faint metallic ratcheting, a turning sound, and then a distinct click. This was followed by the squeak of what sounded like a hinge. Rowena must have found some sort of small hidden compartment in the wall. There was a rustling of paper and then a long sliding sound. Rowena came back into view with a bundle of rolled documents in her hands. She took them over to one of the tables and opened them up. It was hard to tell from a distance what the rolls contained, but they seemed to be architectural drawings of some kind. What was Rowena looking for? Was she studying a diagram of the house so that she would know it well as Serafina and Braden did? Or maybe she'd found the list of guests and was now matching them to the various rooms in the house, like Serafina had told her to. It seemed wrong for Rowena to be snooping around in the library when no one else was there. But then Serafina realized that she herself was doing the exact same thing. Maybe Rowena had some theory she was pursuing about Detective Grayson. When Serafina asked Rowena to join her and Braden, she had no idea the girl would be so committed. She seemed to truly enjoy playing spy. Serafina was eager to hear what she had learned. Just as she thought about revealing herself to Rowena, Serafina heard the sound of footsteps walking down the tapestry gallery toward the main door of the library. Lady Rowena quickly stuffed the drawings back into the hidden compartment in the wall, sat down on the sofa in front of the fire, and pretended to read a book. "This girl is good," Serafina thought as she watched with a smile. That was a trick she'd never thought of before, the old act like everything is fine here trick. A footman came into the room. "I beg your pardon, my lady," the footman said, bowing slightly. "Dinner will be served at the normal hour of 8 o'clock this evening, but please be advised that most of the clocks in the house have stopped, so we are letting our guests know that it's currently 7 o'clock, and they may wish to start getting dressed for dinner at this time. Thank you." Serafina's body jolted when she heard the footman's words. The clocks had stopped? Lady Rowena was here in the library, so that meant Braden had sounded the alarm. He was in trouble. Rowena seemed to understand this as well, for she immediately brushed past the footman and hurried out of the room. Serafina darted from her hiding spot and ran for the rooftop. That's the end of chapter 31.